Good afternoon. This is Grant Swartzwelder with OTA Environmental Solutions, and welcome to the most recent edition of Oilfield Strong webinar and podcast. As we've told you in the past, we have now stripped out the audio and put that into a podcast form too. So look in any of your the podcast forms that you like, and we will most likely be there. You can also look in YouTube where we'll have the webinar with our visuals. That'll be in YouTube under Oilfield Strong. So just search YouTube for that. Today, we're very fortunate to have Kaylin McDermett, or should I say Dr. Kaylin McDermett, who has a master's and a PhD from Texas Tech, but then, which would make her sound really smart, but then she moved to Pittsburgh. So I'm kind of confused here, but that sounds like a personal thing that it sounds like from a business opportunity. We'll put it that way. But Kaylin, we're really glad you're here to talk about all things PFAS. Which is just another acronym in my little head that I'm sure all my listeners get tired of all the EPA and other regulatory forms with all their acronyms. But this seems to be something that is really starting to almost come from nowhere in a way, or that's my vision. You might have a different one. And it just looks like just gaining a lot of momentum. So first of all, Kaylin, what is PFAS? It's a forever chemical. What in the heck does that mean? And then we'll go from there.
Right, of course. Yeah. So thanks again, Grant, for having me today. I'm happy to hop on and talk all things PFAS for you guys. So just as you mentioned, PFAS is often referred to as the forever chemical. So you'll see, kind of hot topic buzzwords, media, you name it. We've got the forever chemical floating around out there, right? And quite simply, PFAS, PFAS, just stands for a group of contaminants that are known as per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So that sounds like a big word, so that's why we like PFAS a little bit better, right? Has a bit more of a ring to it. So basically, these compounds are highly fluorinated synthetic compounds. It's good to keep in mind that these aren't anthropogenic, so there's no natural sources of PFAS that we know of to the environment.
And that's what anthropogenic means. Remember, you're talking to an Aggie that these big words throw us off. So, so that's natural. So this is all man-made synthetics.
Right. So anthropogenic just means man-made, right? So we're looking at things that were developed starting around the 1940s. And these are a very, very popular group of contaminants all the way up through until about the 1990s is when we kind of first started to have a couple of hints that there might be something kind of, environmentally different about these compounds. And I would argue to say that you're right in the sense that these have become, I guess, more of a concern or kind of more of a hot topic in the past few years, just kind of seemingly out of nowhere, right? That's typically what we like to call, an emerging contaminant. Only in this case, this has been around for quite a while. So this isn't a new contaminant group or anything that we're kind of unfamiliar with. We've used it for a long time in a lot of great applications. So at this point, we're looking at a synthetic compound that is pretty much found everywhere, just because, again, as I mentioned, it's pretty widely used. We really liked its properties for a really long time. And we'll talk about, properties and a bit more of, details there here in a little while. But for the most part, the big picture with PFAS and why these are called the forever chemical is that we have a bunch of carbon-fluorine bonds. And for those of you who are chemistry-based like I am, carbon and fluorine, they have the strongest bond that's known kind of on the periodic table, right? So what we're looking at is a chemical that has very, very strong bonds. And what happens in the environment is there's not really any microbes right now, or there's not really any chemical or physical degradation processes that can actually break those bonds because they are so strong. So we're seeing with, typical contaminants, we see a lot of microbes or biological activity, things that'll kind of eat and degrade those compounds over time. So, your BTEX, your typical, oil and gas kind of constituents that we're typically used to seeing, even fluorinated solvents. There's some degree of degradation that can happen with those over time. But for PFAS, just because of that carbon-fluorine bond, that is much more difficult to do. So hence the forever chemical, right? So that's why we kind of have this idea that for the most part, PFAS are forever, and they're kind of really hard to break down, at least with the science we have available right now.
So you say we use it a lot of places, but help us understand like some of the applications, and if you can speak specifically in the oil field, but also just outside of the oil field, because in my research for this, it does seem like it's everywhere. But you might give some examples so that it kind of helps everyone visualize that.
Absolutely. So PFAS kind of, again, as I mentioned, became a big topic or a big kind of chemical that was discovered and kind of implemented way back in the 1940s. So the big industry and the big use for PFAS originally was in the manufacture of a chemical called PTFE. And for those of you who are familiar with it, PTFE is also the chemical name or the actual acronym for Teflon. So Teflon coatings, Teflon cookware, any type of Teflon kind of non-stick, Teflon is the brand name, PTFE is the PFAS, and that's kind of where we really got our first start with PFAS was, again, this introduction of this very non-stick, very practical, very usable application. And since then, we've really seen it kind of take off. So up until about the 1960s, we were looking at PFAS mainly as a manufacturing compound for products. Back in the 1960s, there was actually an incident. So this was actually, it's really interesting if you're interested in like US naval history. The USS Forrestal was a war carrier back in the 60s. They were stationed outside Vietnam. And what happened on the Forrestal is there was a massive fire that broke out one day. And if you're hauling a cargo ship that has a lot of fuel and a lot of fuel-based products, so this ship was actually carrying, jet fighters, as well as a couple of explosive materials. And what ended up happening on the Forrestal is that there was no way for them to extinguish these fires that were fuel-based. So, as we all know, you can't fight a fuel fire or a grease fire with water. So what ended up happening was there was a lot of lives lost that day, unfortunately. It's declared one of the worst naval disasters in US history. And it was all because of a fire that broke out and they had no way to fight it. So about that time is when PFAS started really being put into use in things like AFFF or aqueous film forming foam. So this is that big foam that you guys see at like, the airports, military bases, that big foam that'll put out grease fires. That's what we're talking about here. And back in the 60s is when this really started to kind of become more and more prevalent and being used more and more, I would say.
And how does that manifest itself within the oil industry? Is it additions, or this is a component within frac jobs, or is it just, well, let me just leave it there and let you answer.
So I guess, looking at PFAS, I would love to say that there's, only a handful of PFAS to be worried about, but unfortunately, we're looking at a group of compounds that might have, thousands and thousands, maybe even upwards of hundreds of thousands of different types of PFAS. So again, we're just looking at that carbon-fluorine bond, and there's a lot of different chemicals that can have that. And so what happens typically is, what we see is that PFAS are introduced into a lot of different products that maybe they either unintentionally were added to, or maybe it was a byproduct of another chemical that broke down, or some sort of, synthetic process that introduced PFAS into somewhere where we don't expect it. There's a lot of consumer products like this, and unfortunately, it kind of carries its way over to industry as well, specifically for oil and gas. When we're talking about, typical sources of PFAS in the oil and gas industry, of course, as I mentioned, we're looking at, older facilities maybe that still are equipped with some of that AFFF firefighting foam that was PFAS containing. So, of course, we've got our sites that have oil, grease, our hydrocarbon fires that we need to put out. So that might be a potential source of PFAS on your sites. We're also looking at, PFAS as additives. As I mentioned, it was kind of either unintentionally or unintentionally added to several different products. And with that comes, we like PFAS for its properties, right? So typical properties, things like being a good dispersant, being a good non-stick, being a good surfactant. All of these are properties and, things that we actually might see introduced into things like frac compounds. You're right. So fracking solutions that have proprietary formulas, some of those chemicals might be PFAS or PFAS derived, and you might not even know it just because we're looking at a situation where they have a proprietary formula. This, fluid works great because it's non-stick. It's, it provides a little bit of wiggle room down in the subsurface, right? And that's kind of what we're looking at for PFAS too, is that, whether unintentionally or not, we have seen it in many applications. And when we're looking at even very small concentrations of PFAS in a solution, when you're multiplying that by hundreds and thousands of gallons or pounds that are then applied, you're looking at some concentrations that can creep up a little bit on you. So that would be the main areas where I would kind of focus on, especially if you're working with any kind of proprietary, solvents, degreasers, frac fluids, these proprietary chemicals are what really might kind of raise a red flag for you, in my mind.
And I want to eventually get to what effect PFAS could have on the individual and the communities, but kind of how does it get that way, get there? So you frack a well, might have some PFAS chemical in the proprietary solution, but this isn't necessarily an airborne, it's a water-based, isn't it? So like I can appreciate like the foam and airport that foam gets into the water system, but help me understand how PFAS can end up getting to a place where it can do harm.
Right, so that's a great point. So PFAS are kind of funny in terms of chemicals and how they behave in the environment. We've got some PFAS that really like to kind of stick to organic phases. They really like to stick to soils, and they're not very mobile in water. But we do have a big group of PFAS that are pretty mobile in water, and unfortunately, that's the ones that we're typically looking at in terms of regulation and in terms of health effects as well. So once they get kind of mobilized into the water, as you kind of mentioned, that's when we kind of see our problems, right? So in my mind, when we have, the oil and gas industry, big thing that comes to mind is, of course, integrity of your wells, right? So well integrity, any potential for migration, that's kind of where we would see issues with PFAS arise, right? So if we're looking at a, well-constructed well that has, not really a potential for impacts to the surrounding area, I think at that point, PFAS risks might be pretty low. But if we're looking at a situation where we have some sort of seepage or we have, some sort of introduction where we might not have the strongest casing close to the groundwater, groundwater in Pennsylvania is a little bit different than groundwater in West Texas, right? So that's kind of playing into this too a little bit in the sense that, when we're looking at water impacts and how the PFAS is actually getting to the water, we can have infiltration through the surface in the sense of, as you mentioned, like an airport with firefighting foam, either runoff or surface infiltration to the groundwater. Or in the case of fracking, again, as I mentioned, if there's any type of, deficiencies or potential for migration from your well, that's when you would see PFAS potentially impacting groundwater.
So it seems like for the oil field, then it could be as you frack a well and it gets into the system, it could come back as produced water, and then from produced water that it can either be recycled or needs to be disposed of, and then it gets into the system that way. Am I?
Correct. So, in essence, yes, if there's PFAS that's injected down well, when you recirculate that and bring it up as produced water, there will still be PFAS there, right? So again, the forever chemical, we're not seeing easy breakdown of this. So a very similar thing happens with wastewater treatment plants, for example. We see
Okay.
PFAS enter the system and we see PFAS exit the system, but there's not really any loss in between that we could account for. And same thing with PFAS in the subsurface.
So then the PFAS gets into the system and people start drinking that water, even though goes through the water recycling or what all, but so what effect does that have? Lord knows I put a lot of bad things into my body, and what does PFAS do that drinking Cokes or a harder lit beverage not do?
Right. So PFAS, the big thing with PFAS is we're looking at a chronic long-term exposure here. So this isn't something that, you have, you're not going to get exposed to PFAS and then kind of, immediately develop symptoms. We're looking at long-term effects to populations, and we're looking at long-term effects in things like, endocrine systems. So things such as immune disruptions as well. So there's a lot of potential side effects from long-term PFAS exposure that they're currently investigating. I will say right now, the toxicology is not yet to the point where we're really sure on how PFAS affects humans. And there's also a lot of, unknowns right now when it comes to performing laboratory studies to test for toxicity. For example, a lab rat doesn't necessarily process PFAS and accumulate PFAS the same way a person will. But for people, we are seeing that there is PFAS detected in pretty much throughout the body, throughout the kidneys, the blood, different areas that PFAS kind of accumulates. And that's the big thing here too, is this long-term accumulation over time, which could potentially cause some of these kind of adverse effects.
And when you talk about long-term, is that 5 years or is that 50 years? That, anything you take, if it keeps going, will hurt you eventually, but heck, if it's 100 years, I'm going to be long gone.
Right.
So, and it sounded like we don't quite know, if I kind of pick on a couple of your words, because that's being studied. Is that true or not?
Right, that is true. So again, a lot of this toxicology is kind of brand new. This is emerging science. Back during my PhD, I worked on a bioaccumulation study where we were looking at PFAS accumulation through the food web, where we took a population of contaminated alfalfa grass. We then fed that contaminated grass to a population of crickets, and we watched the PFAS and we kind of tracked it up the food chain as well. So within the PFAS, there's so many different kinds of PFAS, different individual PFAS, and so a lot of the questions right now are, which ones are, again, the most of concern? What's the timeline for that? And, is there any differences or any, discrepancies that we're seeing in the data when it comes to PFAS uptake and accumulation in tissues? And right now, there's still just a lot of evidence to gather, I think. So, in terms of timeline, we're looking at, we've got anywhere between a few years to a couple decades. I think the best kind of review of some of this is looking at some of these potentially impacted areas of PFAS. So looking at big PFAS exposure sites like in North Carolina, we've got West Virginia, some of these big areas where we've had PFAS long-term exposures, and those effects have actually been seen in the communities. So there are some studies there, and there has been some work done, but I think there still needs to be a lot more studied, Grant.
So let's set that over to the side and then talk about, I think part of what's created this interest in PFAS or the publicity on it was April of this year, EPA came up with several different regulation and seemed to really ratchet up the regulation and the interest in that. If you would kind of explain that, but then ultimately what I'm trying to figure out is, okay, they've increased it, but we're based on what you just said, we're not quite sure if they should increase it and that's my words, not yours. Help me understand all that.
Right. So I can say just kind of big picture and based on my, review and kind of keeping up with, the EPA and kind of state of the science right now, the EPA and kind of the state approach right now is very conservative, right? Again, as I mentioned, there's a lot of black boxes. There's a lot of question marks that we don't really know about PFAS. And specifically, when we're looking at toxicity, exposure, and concentrations that we're trying to be protective of, what we're looking at is what's called the most sensitive receptors, right? So that's your elderly, that's your children, that's, people that are immunocompromised. We're looking at those types of receptors. So I think when, EPA is promulgating some of these rules and regulations, I think they're really trying to keep that in mind. However, again, I did kind of mention earlier, we're looking at a science that is kind of evolving at the same rate as our regulations and our legislation, which is kind of different and not something that we see too often, right? So very interesting to just kind of note there. And again, as you mentioned, April 2024 is when the EPA kind of finalized and promulgated several of its PFAS rules here. So we're looking at three main rules that the EPA was able to finalize related to PFAS this April. So the first one is looking at the maximum contaminant levels of PFAS in drinking water. So that's the MCLs. So this deals with all things water treatment. This is for drinking water and potable water sources. They now have a cap on 6 different PFAS species that they're now required to test for and to treat for as well. So looking at drinking water, that's a big area that's been impacted. The other area that's been impacted is reporting and regulations when it comes to things like TSCA, right? So looking at TSCA, which is of course our Toxic Substances Control Act, so also under the EPA, we're looking at TSCA reporting requirements now for PFAS, looking back all the way through. I guess big picture of the rule itself is you are now going to be required to disclose and kind of report on any PFAS containing materials or products that fall under TSCA now, which include things that have been imported or manufactured with PFAS, possibly containing PFAS. And this is looking all the way back to January of 2011, right? So we're going to have a pretty broad window that manufacturers, industry, we're going to have to look back and kind of do a big inventory on what people have been using for the past several years and kind of look to report that to the EPA.
I'm sorry, Kaylin, but that's not for just public drinking water. That's industry-wide. You kind of caught that at the very end. So that's manufacturing. That's where it could potentially. So at first, I thought all the April 2024 EPA regulations were going to be more just drinking water, but that's the gotcha on the oil industry is that this one you're talking about now.
Right. So yes, I would agree that TSCA is going to be kind of the big impact to the oil and gas industry right now. So again, think about all of the other TSCA reportable contaminants or chemicals or compounds that we have going in and out of the oil and gas industry. So PFAS is just going to be added to that list now.
Fantastic. That's what the oil industry needs, is just more
Right.
stuff to keep up with. So is this we talk about EPA, but then I see in different articles about New Mexico really getting into this. And so is this a state thing? Well, it's a federal thing, but it looks like states are getting involved also. So is it both?
Right. So right now it is, again, so there are the federal rules that were just populated or promulgated back in April. So those were finalized. Before that, though, even going back into, 2019, we did have some states that were taking a more of a proactive approach, although the EPA hadn't really finalized or had any values published yet. There were some states that were conducting their own studies and kind of going about this in a different manner. So states like New Hampshire, we've had some input out in the West Virginia area just based on their exposure to PFAS. But that being said, right now it's kind of up to the states. So again, in terms of EPA and state environmental regulations, states can't be less strict than the EPA, but they can be more strict. So I think that goes to your point there about New Mexico, where they're starting to really kind of crack down. So the EPA, again, just has these final rules like the MCL, TSCA reporting requirements. But for the most part, there's not really a whole lot in terms of manufacture, import, or other types of uses or applications of PFAS. But we are seeing that some states, so take Colorado, for example, they're starting to implement their own rules about PFAS containing products, right? So in this case, we have a situation where they are now requiring manufacturers to disclose PFAS or whatever is in their products before they can be used in the state of Colorado. So we are seeing that come down through different kind of avenues. New Mexico is also a great example where we're seeing, this kind of shift and kind of this increase in PFAS awareness and kind of trying to manage the situation as well. Even though the EPA has put forward their findings and their regulations, we are seeing the states kind of following suit, if not getting more strict. So.
Very good. Well, so let's bring this, and you've kind of done this to some degree with those comments, but what this really means to the oil industry. And it sounds like what I picked up there was reporting, but does that mean identifying, but does that mean needing to change the chemical? How deep, what changes will this make or could potentially make within how the oil industry conducts itself?
Right. So in this case, for the oil and gas industry, I would say, big picture is just, make sure you know what you have, right? So when it comes to the materials and the products that you're using, I'd say one of the best resources that you have is those material MDSs, right? So, those chemical paperwork, that we get with all of our products and materials that you receive, that's a good place to kind of identify any potential areas for PFAS, right? And, if you have questions, I think now is the time to ask, ask those manufacturers.
And when you look at the MSDS, it doesn't necessarily jump out as a PFAS, does it? You have to know what the chemical chain is. It doesn't say PFAS or in parentheses PFAS. You got to understand what the chemical configuration is.
Right. So there is some of that involved, but I will say that, some of it's as simple as looking, and if you see fluoro, FLUORO, if you see a fluoro compound or anything that's kind of identified as a potential problem area, that might be starting to raise a red flag, right? So although you're right, there's not necessarily a situation where you can look at an MDS and they'll say, oh yeah, this is a PFAS and here's the structure. Just based on sometimes the chemical name, you might be able to make some assumptions. And I think at that point, you can also, reach out to the manufacturers directly and say, look, I understand you have a proprietary formula, but we got to know what's in it because we have to report, right? So I think that's the big picture here. As well as, reporting when it comes to, this doesn't necessarily just include, manufacturers of PFAS, right? Again, this includes articles that contain PFAS. So a good example, I work with a couple of pharmaceutical clients who use PFAS coated packaging for some of their materials that they import. And now they're going to be required to report on the actual tonnage of imported packaging that they use that contains PFAS, right? So it kind of is applicable in many situations that you might not think about. And I think that with the oil and gas industry specifically, and based on, the chemicals and the substances used, I think this is a time where, I think people have tried to turn a blind eye for a long time, but I think at this point, specifically for the oil and gas industry, that's just not going to be an option anymore for PFAS. So just having a good idea and a good inventory of what you have and how much you use, how much you import. I think that's kind of, they always say knowledge is power, right? So that's kind of the big picture, is just to be aware of, what you have on your sites, right? So
you identify it, you're ultimately going to report it, but right now there's no need to change what you're doing. But is that coming up? Is that if you had to put your PFAS vision goggles on, how does this play out? Does it just become a recording? Does this become a big lawsuit thing? Does it mean having to reconfigure chemical formulas and packaging? Where's this thing go? Because
yeah, so I think, big picture, that's kind of, what we're looking for, right? And at this point, as I mentioned, there's still some science that's evolving. But at this point, with my kind of, forward thinking, vision on, I'm not seeing any reductions in PFAS rulings yet, right? So there might be some lawsuits that come out for some of the big manufacturers, but for the most part, we're looking at something that was kind of, widely used and kind of to no limits, right? So as far as, lawsuits and regulation goes, there's going to be some interesting things that happen. I know a lot of the industry is kind of phasing out the PFAS that they do use because they are aware of the situation. They are aware that, oh, well, we will probably, have to make the change sooner rather than later at this point. So we do see some industries and some big manufacturers kind of make the shift. People that are a lot smarter at chemistry, putting together a lot of cool formulas. But for the most part, this isn't really an issue that I see going away anytime soon. We might have better understanding and we might have, kind of more insight into kind of the role PFAS plays in our kind of society. But for right now, I'm not seeing a situation where it's going to be, any more lax, we'll put it that way.
but there have not been any lawsuits or anything like that yet. So it's
There,
still, or I'm sorry, go ahead, Kaylin.
oh no, that's all right. There have been a few lawsuits that have come out. And again, these are really centered on the big manufacturers, right? So we see that, manufacturers are typically the ones that are, held responsible. There's some multi-million-dollar lawsuits that are coming out. But for right now, we're not seeing a whole lot of industry-specific lawsuits, right? So we're seeing people maybe try. So I know that up here in the Pennsylvania area, we do have a couple of, for example, citizen watchdog groups that are kind of going to bat with PADEP, where we're looking at, they're claiming that the wells that are being installed are drilling and it's a threat of PFAS, right? Because it's that hot topic, it's that buzzword. But for example, I don't see at this point, at least, that there's not, this big push to really get rid of PFAS entirely. It's just, I think we still got a lot to catch up on there. So
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting. Like you say, there's a lot of toxicology and a lot of testing to be done, but then there is kind of this fear because no one wants really bad stuff in their water, but if you don't know, but then if you wait too long, then you're going to add even more liability to what you've got. So it really puts everyone in a pretty awkward spot, it sounds like. So,
right.
well,
Yep.
good. Well, Kaylin, thank you very much for this overview. This is, when I heard your presentation, I knew it was something that just like some of the air emissions and other things that could start really picking up and gaining steam. So this was very helpful to have a base understanding. And I'm predicting we'll have you back on in a year or two and see a lot of development in either the liability or the public relation aspect or the toxicology and have a much better idea. But Kaylin, thank you very much for your time.
Awesome. Yes. Thank you, Grant. I really appreciate the invite. And of course, happy to come on and talk PFAS anytime. So thanks again for the opportunity.
Fantastic. Thank you.